As mentioned at multiple points in the last lesson, Kierkegaard had a particularly strong stance against the philosophy that was presented by Hegel. Now, in this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about that particular stance. We're going to talk a little bit about some Hegelian philosophy, just to get a basic introduction to Hegel. Now, of course, Hegel is famously a very complicated and very difficult to reconcile with and engage with philosopher. So we're not going to be going into too much detail onto the nature of Hegelian philosophy. We're just going to know enough so that we can talk about how Kierkegaard responded to that particular philosophy itself. And that's essentially what the rest of the lesson is going to be involved with, looking at how Kierkegaard tackled with and wrestled with some of the ideas that were presented by Hegel. So the relationship between Kierkegaard and Hegel can be described really as one of quite strong philosophical difference. Kierkegaard really positioned himself as almost the antithesis in many ways to that of Hegel, and he developed the idea of the existential dialectic. And if you are somebody who is familiar, at least partially, with the philosophy of Hegel, or potentially some of the young Hegelians that followed Hegelian philosophy, so for example that of Karl Marx, you might have a basic understanding of what dialectics refers to, and dialectical materialism, for example, if you are looking at Marxist philosophy. So you're going to have a basic understanding of that, and essentially what we're going to do is talk about how Kierkegaard developed on the idea of dialectics, but not from the sort of collectivist rational perspective that Hegel was approaching it, but rather from the existential perspective that he approached it from. So a number of major contradictory philosophical positions were taken by both Kierkegaard and that of Hegel. So, for example, Hegel believed in the fundamental nature of rationality, and in stark contrast to the fundamental nature of rationality, Kierkegaard wanted to centralize the concept of passion and subjectivity in a lot of his philosophy. So he sought to reconcile the centrality of these ideas rather than looking at rationality as a central issue. Hegel can be understood as essentially collectivist, so he understood the world to be very collectivist in nature. Kierkegaard understood the world from a perspective of individualism. So again, complete stark contrast. Hegel was collectivist, Kierkegaard was individualist. Hegel believed that religion is the product of the human collective consciousness and could be understood through that lens, rather than Kierkegaard's position, which was that religion was something that required faith and passionate commitment, and that it was useless, essentially, of trying to apply rationality and logic to the subject of religion, because rationality and logic had no place in the subject of religion and the question of religion, rather than the concept of passion and commitment and faith. So this is really just could be described as the basic summary that we can see in terms of the stark positions that existed between Kierkegaard and Hegel. But let's get into a little bit more detail and talk about the concept of dialectics and how Hegel's development of the concept of dialectics influenced, firstly, Karl Marx in one sense, but then secondly, to probably a lesser extent, the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard. So the theory that Hegel developed is the idea of a dialectic. Now, a dialectic, from the perspective of Hegelian philosophy, can be described somewhat as a grand historical theory, which gives us the idea that we can understand history and the history of human development as having some ultimate purpose. Now, what is interesting for the concept of the dialectic is that a dialectic is described as almost two opposed characters or two opposing contradictory things. There could be many different things. We'll get into examples in a second. But that these two contradictory things are at constant conflict with each other, almost like a yin and yang in a way. And so one example that I'm going to keep referring back to, just because I think that this philosophy is arguably more impactful on the 20th century, is the concept of Marxist philosophy and the development of historical materialism and dialectical materialism in that way. So essentially what Marx said, in a very, very, very quick overview understanding, I'm not getting into too much detail here, is that history can be explained, or at least human development can be explained, as that of a dialectic between those who own the means of production and those who don't own the means of production, and that there's a constant struggle back and forth. And it is this concept of historical materialism, the material means of production, and the ways that dialectics are operated in that sense, that gives rise to a number of other different theories that really underpin a lot of socialist and communist thought. So things like alienation, things like class consciousness, things like ideology, and then all of these different things lead to an understanding of what Marx predicted for the future in terms of the seizing of the means of production, etc., etc. But that is not necessarily relevant in terms of the specificities in this lesson, but it's relevant to understand dialectics in a sense, because it's a good example of a way in which we can understand and give an example of how dialectics operates. So for Hegel, as I've said, history is the development that is exemplified by human conflict. And again, I've just mentioned this already. The young Hegelian Karl Marx developed this understanding even further and started to apply it to a concept of historical materialism, and then developed into dialectical historical materialism. So dialectics are very important for Hegelian philosophy and for a lot of young Hegelians as well who were influenced by Hegel. But they were also quite important for Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard's understanding of existentialism, because he developed his own dialectic, and this is the existential dialectic. And for Kierkegaard, there is a rejection of this Hegelian view of dialectics and an acceptance of a different form of dialectic. Almost in this sense, because Kierkegaard is so much of a contrasting figure to that of Hegel, you could almost understand the existential dialectic as almost a meta-dialectic. It is a dialectic of Hegelian dialectics, which is quite interesting to understand. Now, essentially, what the existential dialectic is fundamentally individualistic in nature, as you could probably imagine from our understanding of existentialism already. The existential dialectic is that of a choice between different modes of existence, with no single rational reason to pick one mode of existence over a different mode of existence. And so this is really the central part of the existential dialectics. There are three modes of existence that, according to Kierkegaard, exist. First is the aesthetic mode of existence, the second is the ethical mode of existence, and the third is the religious mode of existence. Let's start to unpack each of these in more detail. What do we mean when we are talking about the aesthetic mode of existence, according to Kierkegaard? Well, this is a life of pleasure, desire, and hedonism. Pure hedonism, and essentially one lives their life in a way to maximize their own pleasure and satisfaction. You'll see quite a lot of continuity here between that of the aesthetic mode of existence within the existential dialectic and that of very classical basic understandings of utilitarianism and the hedonic calculus and the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, which is quite nice to be able to make links to that of different ethical inquiries. It is a complete choice to take this path, according to Kierkegaard, but he believed that the aesthetic mode of existence is one which has a tendency towards boredom. So he understands that the good life and the achievement of a good life, from an existentialist perspective, would not be satisfied per se by that of the the aesthetic mode of existence, because the idea of pleasure and desire and hedonism essentially will lead to a tendency towards boredom. A constant pursuit of satisfaction becomes insatiable and eventually self-defeating, according to Kierkegaard. An alternative, therefore, is the ethical mode of existence. To follow the ethical mode of existence is to follow the ethics which Kierkegaard understood to be fundamentally deontological. We know already, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, that Kierkegaard aligned himself quite strongly with a lot of the philosophy, or specifically a lot of the ethics of Immanuel Kant, who was that of a deontologist, somebody who fundamentally understood philosophy to be that of the perpetuation of a certain degree of duty, hence the name deontological. The ethical life, or the ethical mode of existence, is one which accepts the universality of ethical principles and then has a duty to follow said principles. We know what the universality concept is if we have ever studied normative ethics, because of that of the maxims of the categorical imperative. There is a maxim of universality, that what is ethical for one individual is ethical for any other individual in any other situation or scenario, and that is placed in conjunction with the means not ends maxim and the kingdom of ends maxim as well within the categorical imperative. We've done lessons on normative ethics already on this channel, so if you want to see those lessons, go over to that playlist when you've done with this. And essentially, in this regard, we see that Kierkegaard is looking at aligning himself with the broad views and principles of that of Immanuel Kant. So this is what the ethical mode of existence essentially gives us. And in doing so, one would be choosing to live rationally, since reason and rationality are key to Kant's ethical principles. But for Kierkegaard, we know that while it may be rational to live in the ethical mode of existence, it is not rational to choose this mode. So we know already that Kierkegaard is relatively skeptical about the perpetuation of a universal principle of rationality, hence why he rejected a lot of Hegelian philosophy. So while it may be rational to, if you choose to live in this mode of existence, you are choosing to live a life of rationality, but the actual choosing itself of this mode of existence among the three in the existential dialectic is not something that is rational. It is not a rational choice that one makes. Rather, we have to think about the final of these existential modes of existence, that being the religious mode of existence. Now, the religious mode of existence is the choice to live a life with the central theme being, of course, a belief in God, as one might expect. And so there is something of a constraint on the views of the existential dialectic here, since when Kierkegaard is talking about a belief in the religious, he's talking about a very specific kind of belief in the religious. And this is really where a lot of people, especially those from a religious perspective, could go about critiquing Kierkegaard's philosophy. Because he's not talking about, for example, an Islamic belief in religion or a Buddhist belief in a religious mode of existence. He's not even talking about Christianity in a broad sense. In fact, he is going further than that. He's accepting Christianity, but he's saying that not all Christianity constitutes this this mode of existence. Rather, the specific fundamentalist view of Lutheranism is the specific kind of Christianity that Kierkegaard adopts. So there's no room for a religious mode of existence to include either any other denomination of Christianity, whether that be Orthodoxy or Catholicism or anything else like that. There's also no room for it to include other religions like Islam or Judaism or Buddhism. So at that point, essentially, Kierkegaard is quite constraining the existence of the religious mode, the actual perpetuation of the religious mode. If in order to be part of this religious mode of existence or to choose this way of life, you can't just accept Christianity, you also have to accept Lutheranism, a very fundamentalist, very specific, relatively niche in this day and age view of Christianity, then that is relatively limited, shall we say.